two parts of what we're going to cover in week 6 of American government. This chapter deals with the news media. You may wonder, since we're going to be talking about the news media, why we're doing that. What does that have to do with government? This isn't a mass communications class after all. Well, last chapter we looked at public opinion. In this chapter, we're going to examine the chief way that the public obtains their information that is used to form those opinions. And the chief way that they do that is from hearing things from the mass media. In a democracy, it's critically important that the people are informed about the world around them, and this is where they get their information. And the people are the ultimate decision makers. They're the ones going to the ballot box to choose their leaders, to make decisions about specific issues sometimes. And so how they get their information, what they do with that information, that's critically important to how well our governmental system functions. If they are making their decisions based on ignorance, then the entire country suffers. And we've talked about that a little bit before, and certainly certain things can influence people, and some things are just kind of randomly done by voters. But the more informed they are, the better we all are as a country, because if they make informed, good decisions, then that's going to make sure our system works well. In modern times, the mass media is the way that people tend to become informed about the world around them and obtain the information on which they base their decisions on election day. And so we're going to look at the role of the media because it is a critical player in our system of politics in the modern world today. In a democracy, we have something called the marketplace of ideas, and this is really what is the foundation of democratic government. This means that the people must be free to express their political opinions and discuss those opinions with their fellow citizens. That's what the marketplace of ideas really is. The idea is that different ideas will be talked about, that people will get to hear one another's views on things, and that people will be attracted to the best ideas, giving them widespread support. So as the issues are discussed, people will be attracted to one or the other, of the viewpoints on those ideas if we're debating something. And that's how we make our decisions, is through this process of debate. People will argue about things, hopefully politely, not always, but we will kind of chew on these issues. And through that process of discussion is how we make our decisions. And that's how we end up with the policies that we follow as a country. And so that has to be able to function. We have to be able to get those ideas out there. And ideally, through the process of this public debate, the best ideas will be the ones that end up percolating to the top and end up becoming government policy. And if that's true, the entire country will be successful. The best ideas will attract the most people, the most support, and then we'll elect people into office that believe in those ideas, and we'll put them into practice, and then we all benefit as a result. And because of this, because we depend on this marketplace, the freedom to exchange ideas is essential to a free society. If we want to live in a free country, we can't get by without the marketplace of ideas. We have to be able to freely share our thoughts about government policies, what our government ought to be doing, and be able to share these ideas with one another. And that is a large reason why our Bill of Rights guarantees the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and assembly. It's not just because it's nice to have those personal liberties, and certainly it is. We don't want the government telling us what to think, say, or do, but because they are required in a democratic system. We have to have this marketplace of ideas functioning in order to have a working democratic form of government. In a modern society, a free media is essential if that marketplace of ideas is going to function. We have a large country, and we can't, all 300 million of us, sit down and have a cup of coffee together and hash out our political ideas and things like that. So the only way that we can really have a nationwide conversation about some of these issues is through the mass media, and that allows us to reach large numbers of people. In a free and open democracy, the media must be free to report on any story at once, whether the government likes it or not. So even if it makes somebody in the government look bad, they have to have the freedom to be able to report on that. Otherwise, we really don't have a true marketplace of ideas. And if we didn't have this kind of freedom, it would be impossible to have an honest conversation about government policies. And if we were afraid, oh, we can't publish this story because it might upset the government and someone will go to jail, that shuts down the marketplace. And so we really rely for our government to function on the idea that and we have to be able to have an honest conversation. We can't worry about offending the government, and so the government has to be able to tolerate people voicing opinions that disagree with government policies. Not all countries work like we do. For example, in communist China, the media is tightly controlled. It can't print just any story at once. The government tries to stamp out the marketplace of ideas because there is one party, the Communist Party, that's in control of the government. They want to stay in control of the government. And so they don't want you to look at alternative ideas. And so they will try to have a tight control over the media because they don't want any alternatives to their governmental system from being discussed, because that might give people ideas. And so they can't afford to have people who have opinions that disagree with government policy getting a voice, because that might attract additional people to that view, and before long the government would lose grip. And so if people start having divergent opinions, that would threaten the rule of the government. The idea that one party should be able to rule the government with basically no restrictions, because that's what they have now. And so controlling that flow of information controls what the people are thinking. People won't, if they don't get these new ideas in the first place, then they won't be attracted to them and they won't threaten the government's grip on power. And so in some countries that aren't free and open democracies like ours, all of the media is controlled by the government, and that's just in order to keep the people under control. Because if we can shut down that marketplace, then people won't have any alternative ideas to what the government's already doing, so there's nothing new and different to rally behind, and the government won't have any challenges to its authority. And so in countries that are not democracies, such as the People's Republic of China, they will have a tight control over the media. They may allow some limited freedom, but if you say something the government doesn't like, they will censor it, they will shut it down, they might even throw you in jail. And they have to keep that kind of control, or other new ideas might start percolating that will attract people to those ideas, and before you know it, they want to change the system and be able to have explore different options for their society rather than having one party in charge of everything. So in dictatorships, and governments like that, they shut down the marketplace of ideas entirely. And so you see how important the media is to a free and open society. We have to have those ideas flowing around, be able to discuss those openly and honestly. In America, we are blessed to have an environment that has some of the most freest and unrestricted media in the world. It plays a very important role in American life as a result. TV is still probably the most important medium at this point. Who knows what will happen in the years to come, since everything is going on the internet and streaming and whatever. But for right now, at least, TV is critically important. As I said, the internet is growing in importance, but right now, TV tends to be the most significant vehicle of information. Television has, in fact, played an important role in shaping American culture, and along with that, politics. And we've already mentioned that American culture wasn't always the same in different regions of the country. Early in our history, there was very little in common between someone who lived in Massachusetts and someone who lived in Georgia or South Carolina. They had very different cultures, they talked differently, they had a different vocabulary, different ways of earning a living, just lots and lots of differences. So American culture wasn't one homogeneous thing for all of American history. There was a lot of regionalism in different areas of the country. But TV has played a huge role in standardizing American culture from coast to coast. What happens is that people all across the country are able to consume the same media. They watch the same TV shows. They see the same live news events unfolding. And that kind of smooths out the differences in the culture when we're all watching the same things and seeing the same things, enjoying the same entertainment. It's allowed the country to be tied together by common experiences in a way that has diminished these regional differences and kind of created a common American culture. And for a lot of American history, there were lots of regional differences, but now, everyone watches the same hit TV shows. Everyone, if there's a live news event unfolding, they will watch the news coverage of that and feel like they went through something together. They experienced that event together, and even sporting events and things like that. So it really has done a lot to erase those regional boundaries and kind of make a common American culture. So TV has played a huge role in changing American society. TV has also been very important in politics itself, and that's been going on for a lot of decades. A classic example of that is the 1960 presidential election, and that was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Nixon would later go on to become president a few years later, but Kennedy ended up winning this particular election, and they faced off for the first ever TV presidential debate. And interestingly enough, those listening on the radio thought Nixon won the debate. He got his ideas across very well, seemed articulate, was able to make really good arguments. However, those watching on TV thought that Nixon looked uncomfortable and untrustworthy. The lights were really hot. He was kind of pale. He was sweating. And so Kennedy, by contrast, looked very well poised and has carried himself well as a handsome guy. And so the ones on TV really thought that Kennedy had won. So who knows if it was all because of that debate, but Nixon went on to narrowly lose that election. And so that really just proved to everybody how important TV can be at shaping politics, because it may have changed a lot of votes watching Nixon sweat under those hot TV lights, looking uncomfortable. That may have changed a lot of people's ideas. So TV can certainly have a big impact on political races and other political debates. Another example of that was during the Vietnam War. And the war dragged on for many, many years and was controversial. People were speaking out in opposition to the Vietnam War, but it really made people sit up and take notice when the respected news anchor Walter Cronkite announced on the air that he had grave doubts about American policy in the war and the country's ability to win that conflict. And so his opinion was widely respected, and support for the war dropped as a result. So he had a direct impact on public opinion as it concerned this particular issue. And so for a long time, we've known that TV can have a major impact on how public opinion is formed and how different political ideas and candidates can fare. Because media is so important to our democracy, most people oppose much government control over the media. We try to keep that to a minimum because we want to promote that marketplace of ideas, and government regulation impedes the free flow of those ideas. The more rules and regulations we have, the less free flow of ideas is taking place. As a result, the government has very little power to censor or block media coverage, and censor just means the ability to have control over what's being broadcast and to allow some things and not others. And the government normally doesn't have the power to do very much of that. We do see with the broadcast media, now we're going to talk about history of the media within the United States. And this goes back a long way. The United States has had mass media from the very beginning. Not like we have today, of course. In revolutionary times, it consisted solely of printed material, newspapers and pamphlets and things like that. And in fact, the newspapers and leaflets that were making the rounds before the revolution were instrumental in building public support for the break with Britain. And that was the only way people across the colonies could know what was going on. It took a really long time to get on a horse, and ride from northern Massachusetts down to southern Georgia, for instance, back in those days. They didn't have interstates and cars or trains or really anything. Ships that had sails. That was about it. So getting word around was really hard, but these little pamphlets and things that they would print up and share with each other, that really formed some kind of common bond among the colonists. They started sharing ideas about maybe they didn't need the British government in their lives anymore. And so they played a key role in getting support up for the American Revolution. At that time, most people never learned how to read, but still the news media of the day allowed for the transmission of ideas across the colonies and rallied people to the cause of independence. If they couldn't read them themselves, friends would read them to them and whatever, and then there'd be word of mouth and they would talk about it. And so this media, primitive as it was, really had a huge impact on leading to the Declaration of Independence. Later on, newspapers were a battlefield between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, talking about ratification of the Constitution. We looked at that long ago when we talked about how the Constitution came to be. But these arguments between people with different political views were aired out in the newspapers of the day. That's how they had those debates. So again, the media played an important role there. And with all that going on, it's not surprising, really, that the Founding Fathers recognized the importance of the free press and guaranteed that freedom with the First Amendment. That's in there along with several other freedoms of speech and assembly and so forth. But clearly, to our, from the very beginning of the country, the freedom of the press became something that was not taken lightly. They understood its power and the necessity of having it in a free country. Throughout the first part of the 1800s, most newspapers were expensive, and they were read mainly by the wealthy elites. They were the only people who could read anyway, typically. They sent their kids to school, and most poor people did not because it wasn't free and public like it is now. And so unlike today, when, we just a little bit of pocket change will buy you a paper, it was kind of a luxury back then, and not everyone was able to afford one. And back in those days, most newspapers were founded by a political party or an individual who wanted to use that paper to push a political agenda. And that was known as the party press. And so today, when we pick up a newspaper, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or something, we'll talk about media bias a little bit later, but normally what we're expecting to see is a fairly fair and accurate rendition of whatever news story that's being talked about. They don't expect there to be a rooting for one political party or another explicitly, at least, unless it's the opinion section or something. But if you're just reading a news story, you expect it just to be the facts, a fair reporting of the facts. Well, that was not the case back then, because these newspapers were founded by someone who was pushing a particular point of view. And so the people who believed in that point of view were the ones who were bought by the paper. And so that's how they would discuss their ideas. And so that's how we started out. Well, things really began to change by the 1830s when what we call the penny press developed. And the penny press was made up by newspapers who got their name because they were much cheaper. They sold for a penny. And that was something that common people could actually afford. And the reason they were so much cheaper than older papers was because they raised money through selling ads. And so if you flip through the paper, you would see, a ad for Jones's Dry Goods Store or something, and that's where they got a lot of their income. So they were able to make it the price for their readers to be a lot cheaper. And so they would make a profit by selling lots and lots of newspapers. Instead of selling a few to at an expensive price to a few rich people, they would sell a lot of papers to middle class or poorer people and make a lot of money through these ads. So this really marked the emergence of newspapers as a true mass medium. It was trying to get to as many people as possible. Unlike the party press, it wasn't targeted at a specific narrow audience. They were trying to get everybody to read this paper. And for the ads to be effective, the papers had to reach as many people as they possibly could. And so they couldn't really be wedded to one political viewpoint. Because people have different viewpoints. Well, they had to appeal to everybody, and so they had to kind of fairly cover these stories without putting one party's slant on it or another. And so they ended up having to be more fair and balanced on their reporting and the stories that they had in there. And along this time, they began to report on news objectively, which means without pushing one particular viewpoint. And they employed professional reporters who were supposed to go out and accurately, dig through the facts and accurately report on what they found. And so this kind of began the development of what we think of as modern journalism. And it continued to improve in the 1840s when the telegraph came along, and that allowed for the instantaneous transmission of news. Prior to that point, news only moved as fast as people could move, and people were moving only on horseback or in sailing ships or later on trains. And so news moved very slowly, and that changed with the development of the telegraph. And so these newspapers could pick up stories from around the country that they would learn of via the telegraph and then print them quickly. And so that really helped out the spreading of the news. And so this is where we really see the modern media, like we see it, begin to develop, because the idea is that you pick up one of these papers, you would get an accurate story that wasn't colored too much by the viewpoint of the reporter who wrote it. The reporters were just supposed to report the facts in an objective manner, being fair to all parties, and not push a particular viewpoint. And so that was really a dramatic change from what had gone on earlier. Well, they were supposed to be objective and professional in the newspaper business, but that credibility took a hit in the late 1800s when something called yellow journalism developed. And that happened when several newspapers began trying to sell as many papers as they possibly could, not by, having boring but accurate stories, but they really tried to sensationalize the news stories, even if that meant making up a few details, kind of bending the truth a little bit. And so they would kind of bend the truth, and they would sacrifice accuracy for the sake of what we could call sexing up the stories. They would try to make them as titillating as possible, and maybe throw in some details, maybe make up a few things that would make the story a little bit more interesting, and so as a result, the accuracy suffered. Well, yellow journalism ended up causing a big backlash because people wanted to be able to believe what they were reading. And they started figuring out some of these stories were fake, or had elements that were fake. And that really helped modern journalism develop as well. And there became a code of journalistic ethics. And that would govern the conduct of reporters and publishers because they were kind of seen as having a public trust. They were supposed to be responsible for reporting the news accurately because people understood how important the media was to public opinion and forming political ideas and things like that. And if we can't trust what we're reading, then people get the wrong ideas. If they had false information, they would go to the polls and vote inaccurately. They would make good decisions. We had depended on the news media to give us the information we need accurately, and this was destroying that. And so there was a big backlash against it because people realized it was undermining how our democracy was supposed to function. Well, technology continued to develop with radio becoming popular in the 1920s, and this really changed a lot of things. For one thing, it allowed for the instantaneous reporting of news across the country and around the world. Up to this point, the telegraph had allowed for newspapers to pick up stories pretty quickly, but they then had to print a newspaper, and bundle them up and ship them out and put them in people's hands. And so the news was still several hours old by the time people found out about it. But here, radio, they could just turn on their radio and hear the story as it was happening. And so that was fairly new for them to be able to get information so quickly. It wasn't too long before networks of stations began to emerge, which meant that people all over the country began to listen to the same programs and become part of the same popular culture. We were looking just a few slides ago about the impact of TV on that, and that certainly accelerated the process, but that really began back in the age of radio. And before there were networks of TV stations like ABC, NBC, and CBS, there were radio networks called ABC, NBC, and CBS. And so the same kind of thing happened to where they would have common shows, and people would turn on the radio in the evening and listen, to their favorite drama or comedy or whatever the case might be. Even listen to the same music or whatever. And so that started breaking down these regional differences way back in the early part of the 20th century with radio. And so that really started to change American culture then. In some countries, such as Great Britain, and we'll look at their system a little bit more detail in a few slides from now, but the government owned nearly all the broadcast stations and controlled the radio airwaves. But that's not how it happened in America. This new media outlet remained in private hands and became an important way for the public to be informed. And so the government pretty much stayed out of the picture for a while, except coming in to regulate who was using what frequency and that kind of thing. But in terms of the content, the government stayed out of it. And so in America, there were all kinds of voices that got to be heard on the radio, and so that really helped the marketplace of ideas unfold and using this new technology. TV came along in the late 1940s and really became popular in the 50s when TVs got a little bit cheaper and people could afford to buy one. Again, most stations became affiliated with one of the big three networks. That was kind of grew out of those radio networks that had been around for a while. So that meant that people actually had fewer sources of information to choose from in a way. So that was kind of bad in a sense, because if everything's coming through three networks, that's your three sources of information that way. But still, people were able to get a lot of news and information that they hadn't been able to get before. And TV has proven to be a very powerful medium because it can show things to us, not just that we hear things, we get to see them. And that just makes an emotional impact on us, especially if there's live news breaking and we can see what's going on. There's a car chase or something that's exciting, or there's some kind of crisis erupting or a disaster, or, we get to see the pictures. That just really changes things. It has a bigger impact on people. And viewers feel an immediate connection to what they see happening on the screen. And so that has had a huge impact on how people get information and also the effect that it has on them. Media has continued to evolve and has never stood still, certainly. Cable and satellite TV came along after broadcast TV became popular, and that meant that people have tons of choices in terms of media outlets. They're no longer constrained to 3 networks, and so you flip through, DirecTV or Dish or whatever you have, or your cable system, you end up having tons and tons and tons of channels. A lot of times there's nothing on, but there's all kinds of choices that you have for getting your information. So that has made, a big impact on the marketplace of ideas because there's more ideas that have a place to be heard now. And so that's had a big impact. Also, the internet has allowed anyone with a connection to the World Wide Web, basically, to become a news source. You can start your own blog, and people have had huge impacts by becoming part of the news media themselves. They'll start a blog and start writing about something they think is important. And so that has really increased exponentially the amount of news sources that we have. That, though, has caused a new problem, and that's getting reliable information. You can usually expect when you pick up the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or something, you read a story in there, you expect it's gone through several hands, people have checked and rechecked the facts to make sure it's accurate, an editor has looked at it to make sure it's accurate, and before they actually put it in print, you can kind of trust it. Anything you read on the internet, you don't know where it came from, you don't know if it's been verified, you don't know anything about the source a lot of times, so you have no idea if that stuff is reliable. So that's become a new problem. And if you want an example of that, take Wikipedia, which Wikipedia, if you're a student, can be a great tool for starting your research because even the best articles will cite good sources. But Wikipedia is not like your Encyclopedia Britannica. It's not written by professional researchers. It's written by just people like you and me, and anyone can edit those stories. You can go on there and make changes and edit things, delete things, and add things. If I wanted to say, go in there and edit the article on Barack Obama and say he's from Mars, I could do that. And until someone changes it back, that's what it's going to say. So, those articles on Wikipedia have zero credibility and never, ever, ever cite those to support your work in a research paper, or your teacher will go out and beat you because it's just has no credibility at all. And a lot of stuff you read on the internet is like that. We don't know where it came from or who wrote it or anything else. And so we have to be really critical consumers of information now, because before there weren't that many sources, but we could kind of trust those sources. Well, now we see so many different people saying so many different things, and we don't know what to believe unless we do our own research. And so we need to be critical consumers of information and be able to kind of sift through the wheat from the chaff there and separate the good stuff from the bad, so we'll be able to understand what to take seriously and what not to. Let's talk about some philosophy that's behind the operation of the media and how some folks think it should operate versus how it does. Because the media has become so important to our democracy, there is a debate about what role the media should play, because they have a big responsibility because they kind of form that marketplace of ideas. We rely upon them for that. And so there's a couple different theories about how the media ought to operate. One is called the social responsibility theory. This says that the media is so important as a means of getting those ideas across to the public, that the media has a responsibility to give us the information we need to be informed citizens, whether we want to see it or not. And remember, in America, most of the media is in private hands. The government has very little to do with it. And so, as a consequence, the media is trying to earn a buck. They're trying to make a profit through advertising or selling subscriptions or whatever the case might be. And so there's a natural tendency for them to give us what we want, because that's what we're willing to pay for. But the social responsibility says they kind of serve a higher purpose, and whether they really want to or not, whether they will sell more ads or not, they have a responsibility to tell us what we need to hear, whether or not that's what we want to hear. Let's look at an example where this might come into play. Let's say that there's something called the armadillo flu, and it's a potentially fatal disease. It has a potential to cause a nationwide health emergency within the next few years, and people really ought to know about that, how to prevent it, and recognize the symptoms or whatever. So the executives at one of the TV networks realize this, and they know this is a really important issue people should know about, and they have a documentary on armadillo flu that they could air that would inform millions of Americans about this important issue. However, they know that most people just don't care about this issue. They don't want to hear anything about it, and so this program, if they air it, would not get very high ratings. Thus, they wouldn't be able to make much money off of advertising, so that's going to hurt their bottom line. And they're, of course, a business, and so they want to make money. So instead of the documentary, they could show a football game that would earn huge ratings and make millions and millions of dollars. So what do? Well, those who believe in the social responsibility theory could argue that the network has a responsibility to the public. They need to run this documentary informing people about this threat. And despite the fact that the network wouldn't earn as much, and they would argue that we have to depend on the media for important information, and the media has a duty to provide that information. Whether we really want to hear it or not, they need to tell us what we need to know, just not what we want to hear. And so that's kind of the social responsibility theory in action, that the media, and that while they're trying to make a buck, they need to understand they have a responsibility to keep us all well informed of the things that we need to hear, whether or not we're willing to actually tune in and watch it. So that's the social responsibility theory, one major take on the role of the media in our society. The second view, though, is called the libertarian view. And these folks who hold this view feel that the media outlets ought to be able to show whatever they want to. Whether they shouldn't feel some kind of high and mighty duty to tell us what we need to hear, but they can do whatever they want. So it's okay in this theory to be driven by money and ratings. People have choices, and they will not watch the things that they don't want to see. Everyone has free will, and so people ought to be able to watch, tune into what they want to see, rather than have someone tell them this is good for you and you need to eat your vegetables and watch this documentary, kind of a thing. The idea is that if something really is important enough, it will gain people's interest anyway, and then they will want to watch it. So, for example, if the armadillo flu becomes a health emergency, if it really looks like it's going to become a huge crisis, people will get scared by that. They will want to know more information. They would want to watch these programs. So they would tune in droves to this documentary. So the libertarian view is that if we just leave things up to the free market, all this will take care of itself. The media shouldn't feel like it's high and mighty and should tell us what we need to hear rather than what we want to hear. That if it's really that important, people will care anyway, and so all this will take care of itself. If it's that important, they will want to watch this stuff, so the media will want to tell us about it, and we'll get the same information anyway. And so two very different views on the role of the media, but certainly people who get into the philosophy and ethics of this stuff can disagree about the role of the media and what it ought to be doing in these areas. In many countries, as we mentioned, broadcast media is owned by the government. It's not in private hands. For example, in Great Britain, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, is a primary news outlet that owns many of the radio and TV stations in the country. And there started to be some competitors for it in recent years, but for many years it was pretty much it. The BBC was what you watched if you turned on your TV in Great Britain, and it was all owned by the government. And it's a government corporation, and it has a duty. It carries out this social responsibility theory. It tries to keep people informed whether they like it or not. It may air things that it knows not many people will watch because it thinks it'll make them better people. You may not want to watch a ballet, but if it thinks that showing you a ballet is good for you, that's what it will do. And so it's not worried as much about ratings as profit-driven private media outlets would be. And so this is an example of the social responsibility theory in action. The BBC is going to give you the news information you need, the hoity-toity cultural things like operas and stuff that you need, that thinks that you will be a better person for watching. And so it really puts those ideas into practice. And until a couple of decades ago, there weren't even any private TV broadcasters in the UK. And so now there are several different channels, and if you have satellite, there's even more. But the BBC was the only game in town for a while. And it was seen that having it as a government-sponsored entity was really important because we needed to tell people what they needed to hear, not just what they wanted to. Well, in America, we have PBS, which is the closest thing that we have to being like the BBC, and it's government-sponsored. They have pledge drives all the time where they're trying to raise money from the public, and so it kind of sputters along on government handouts and people's donations. But the things that are on PBS a lot of times are educational. May not be that many people that want to watch them. Its ratings are consistently pretty low. Nevertheless, they give us access to information we ought to have as informed citizens. So they will cover the arts. They'll have the opera singers warbling and things like that. They will show classical music concerts or whatever, and they will show these interesting documentaries. How do we make cheese, or how are rocks made in the Earth's crust, or whatever the case may be, stuff that makes us better people. And so that's kind of the role that they take. But they're kind of a public-private partnership in a way. They're not entirely government-owned like the BBC, but the government does play a role in that, trying to get that information out there. So they play a role, but they're not the primary place that we get our information from in this country, certainly. But some countries take a very different approach to that. So despite PBS, the libertarian view has largely won out in America, and almost all the news outlets are privately owned. PBS does have a news broadcast. It's usually pretty good, called the News Hour. It's on every night, 7 days a week now. It tries to keep a balanced view of the news and stuff. But there's a lot of other places out there in the private news media that is other ways to get your information if you want to. So that's largely the view that has taken over America's libertarian view, but certainly not true of other countries. Well, let's talk about the role of the media, and it plays several different important roles in American politics, and we're going to look at these individually, kind of examine the different roles that the media plays. One of those roles is what we call being a watchdog. Kind of an odd term, but just think of, if you are living alone and you have this faithful, mean-looking dog that's there guarding you and barking at strange people who pull in your driveway. That's kind of what the media does for us in a way, is being that watchdog, letting us know about dangerous things and concerns that we need to hear about. This term really refers to the idea of investigative reporters, spending their time trying to catch people doing things they shouldn't be doing, including those in government. The idea that the media spends a lot of its time investigating, digging through, looking for corruption and bad things that people are doing that they shouldn't be doing, trying to make the world a better place by exposing crooks and misuse of public funds and all that kind of stuff. And we will see that happen quite a bit sometimes. The media will be digging through the mud trying to find wrongdoing and expose it. A few years ago, as an example, reporters discovered that veterans who were returning from the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, they would show up at this hospital in Washington, D.C. called Walter Reed Army Hospital, and they were not getting good care. The place was falling apart. They weren't taking care of them like they should have. And so some reporters found this out, published stories about it. There were news coverage on TV, and people were outraged by that. And it wasn't very long, the president was on the scene, making promises that these problems were going to get fixed. And so if that hadn't been for the news media, those problems might never have come to light. That mismanagement might have continued to occur. And so we can rely upon the media to kind of expose these problems that are taking place in government. In the early 1990s, reporters caught congressmen taking vacations paid for by lobbyists, which are people who are paid to change congresspeople's minds about how they're going to vote on things. They'll have clients, like the drug industry or something, will pay these lobbyists to go pay a visit to these congressmen and try to change their minds about how they're going to vote for a bill. Well, these lobbyists, as it turned out, were spending big money taking these Congress people to the Bahamas and stuff, and filling them full of pina coladas and sunny beaches and stuff, trying to change their minds. Well, that looked horrible. That looked like it was corrupt. And so congressional ethics reform was soon being discussed once these news stories started airing, showing these Congress people laying on the beach, on someone else's dime. That really got people riled up, and so there were changes. And that's two examples of the media being a watchdog. And so in this role, the media tries to keep the government on its toes, make sure that it's really serving the needs of the people, and that it's not being corrupt, that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And so we can rely on the media to do things like that, and to keep kind of a watch over stuff and make sure that everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing. So being a watchdog is one role that the media plays. Another one is what we call interpretation. And the idea here is that some subjects are just so complex that most people, especially with today's hectic world, they're being pulled in different directions by jobs and family and organizations they belong to and all that stuff. They just don't have time to do their own research that they would need to understand the pressing issues of the day, whatever those happen to be themselves. And, they're not going to go sit down in the library and figure out things like Social Security reform or trade policy with China, nuclear arms reduction, those sorts of things. People just don't have time to do the research themselves. And so they'll rely upon the mass media. And the people in the media, reporters and producers and so forth, they will research those issues and present stories on news programs that digest this material and present it in a fairly brief way that gets the main points out there so that people can understand these issues without having to work so hard at it themselves. And so while people might not take the time to figure out issues like this on their own, and they might sit down and watch a piece on 60 Minutes or some other news program, and they'll become a better informed citizen as a result. But they rely upon those reporters and the media outlets to kind of do that digging and kind of take the story, all this raw information, and turn it into something that they can consume, within an hour, half hour, even just a few minutes of watching a program or reading a new story in the newspaper, whatever it might be. And so they rely upon the media to kind of take all this information and digest it into a form that just ordinary people with busy lives can kind of sit down and get a good idea of what's going on in the world and what the different issues are. Interpretation, though, comes with controversy because the media, while they're taking all this information and turning it into a story, they have control over how to frame the story. And they might emphasize some parts of the story, downplay others, make certain selections of word choices and things that'll potentially influence public opinion. Maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, but however they present the news story can in fact have effect on how people will perceive that story when they see it. And over the years, many have claimed that there is a pervasive media bias, especially against conservative points of view. You will hear this complained a lot, especially from Republican politicians or conservatives on that side of the political spectrum who will claim this. And there's a little bit of evidence to back up some concern, perhaps. There was a study, for example, in 1995 showing that 4% of reporters identified themselves as a Republican, and a full 50% said they were Democrats. Others wouldn't respond or said they were independent. And so numbers like that make people say, see, we told you that, they have it in for us because most reporters belong to one political party. And so whether that's true or not is a matter of debate. But some argue that those in the media can use these subtle methods like word choice or selective reporting on certain issues and not others to sway public opinion to their own point of view, and either intentionally or unintentionally. It just may be that a reporter sees the world this way, and so that's how they'll present the story to the public. For example, there were many complaints during the Iraq War that the media overreported acts of violence that were occurring in the country, while underreporting stories of success like rebuilding schools and hospitals and things like that. Things that were good that were happening, that they would be underreported, while the bad things that were happening would be reported a lot more, and that would have the effect of shifting public opinion against the war. And so people will make that claim a lot. However, many other people believe that media bias either doesn't exist or it's greatly exaggerated. And so this is certainly an issue of some debate, and media critics who do these kinds of studies have turned out studies that purport to show that media bias doesn't exist at all, or at least not on the level that critics claim that it does. And so there's just a lot of debate about this. It's probably not going to end anytime soon, but as long as the media is interpreting these stories, you can see how that might come into play, because when they're the ones choosing how to present the topic to the public, there is that potential for inserting their own viewpoint, however subtly, into there, either unintentionally or intentionally. And so certainly it does pay to have a healthy respect for the media and do your own homework as much as possible and be a critical consumer of news media because, whether it actually occurs or not, there is a chance that it might, and so we certainly need to be critical consumers of the news when we read it or watch a program and ask questions and think about it because we shouldn't just be spoon-fed all this stuff and accept it uncritically. So whether this is true or not, we do need to be sophisticated consumers of the news media and, double check and, think about things before we accept it as the gospel truth. Agenda setting, or what we would call gatekeeping, is another role that the media has to play. And this is the process that is used in deciding what stories to cover. The media can determine what issues people are interested in and are talking about by deciding to run a story on something or deciding not to run a story on something. As an example, there might be an issue that very few people in America know anything about or care about. For instance, the plight of poor immigrant farmers in Guatemala. Guatemala is a long way away. It's on the other side of Mexico. We don't know a lot about that country. We don't really spend a lot of time caring about, what's happening to the poor people in that country. But if they start seeing news stories about it, it's telling about this horrible life that these people are living and the things that they deal with on a daily basis and their struggles and hopes and dreams and so forth, people will start to care. They might even demand that our government do something to help, send some foreign aid down there or something. By selecting the news stories that we get to see, the news media has the power to kind of get people to care about things. And so by choosing not to report on something, they have the ability to kind of influence people, not to care about it. And by reporting on something, they have the power to influence people to care about it. And so that gatekeeping role, choosing which stories are important, is kind of important and can have a big effect on people's opinions. And, again, there might be the potential for bias in this, but somebody has to do this because otherwise there's so much going on in the world that if we would, there wasn't someone filtering that, it would just be overwhelming. Just think about in your own hometown, all the news stories that might crop up over a week, and then multiply that by the number of hometowns across the United States and around the world. Somebody has to figure out, what's important. What do people really need to know about? Otherwise, it's just this huge global chatter that just kind of drown you out. It'd be like listening to, 1,000 TV stations at once. Somebody has to kind of filter through, figure out what's important, what people really need to know about. And so this is an important role. It kind of helps people focus on the things that are really important. And so hopefully that's done in a fair and objective manner. But somebody has to do it because otherwise we would just be overwhelmed by the amount of information generated in the world today. Let's talk now about the role of media in politics itself. And in today's modern governmental system, the government and the political process are both completely dependent upon the media. And so much so, it kind of epitomizes this relationship. The president has a full-time press secretary. This person, their sole job is to have daily press conferences, stand up there in front of a room full of reporters, and tell them what the president's doing, what he thinks about various issues, and answer questions from those reporters. And so that just shows you how critically important it is, the media's role is to the government being able to function and the political process functioning, that the president of the United States would have somebody in a full-time role of just speaking to the media. That just really shows how important it truly is. And in today's world, the president couldn't communicate with the American people without the help of the media. There are 300 and some million of us, and there's no way the president could sit down and talk with all of us. He's got to use some kind of mass media to get that message out. And so they come to rely on that to really be able to talk to the American people in a pretty direct way. And so the media plays a huge role in helping the government get its message out and keeping people informed. This goes back a long way. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, President Roosevelt conducted some famous talks. There's only 2 or 3 of them actually, but they're still famous to this day, called fireside chats. And the idea is, kind of sitting around the fireplace, with a good friend and talking about the issues of the day. And President Roosevelt kind of cast himself in that role of, I'm your friend, let me tell you what's going on in the United States today. And so that was a time when people were really anxious. They were really upset about the economic condition of the country. A lot of them were on hard times, worrying where their next meal was going to come from. And he just got on the radio and kind of acted like their friend and talked to the people directly. And that was something that was really unique, because before then, reporters might interview the president, publish a news story, but you're reading what the reporter said, not what the president wanted you to hear necessarily. And so here the president was able to cut out the middleman and just talk directly to the people, and was able to gain support from the American people. It would kind of pushed reluctant Congress into doing what the president wanted to do, and that became very effective. And so today, presidents will deal directly with the people. They want to get something done, they will appeal to the people of the United States, speaking through the media channels, trying to get to people. And even if Congress doesn't want to play ball, the president can go talk to the people, get the people riled up, and when the people back home get riled up, then congressmen start wanting to do something. And so in this way, the government can talk directly to the people in this way. So the media plays a huge role in that. And so if the president has an important issue to discuss or some big new policy that he wants Congress to enact, the first thing that he does these days, he heads straight for the TV cameras to explain to the American people what he wants to have happen and why. And so it's just become second nature. And it wasn't always that way, but it is now. The media has just taken on such a really important role in politics. And when it comes to elections themselves, the media is also extremely important. For instance, you can see the effect during a presidential race. A lot of times there will be a bunch of people initially declare that I'm running for president. Well, how do we narrow those candidates down to just two and then end up choosing one to be the president? Well, that's a process. But let's say we start out with a dozen candidates running for president on one side, Republican or Democrat, whichever the case may be. Well, it's going to be hard for voters to be able to pick one of those because, is one going to stand out from the others? Well, maybe, but maybe not. But sometimes the media starts talking about one of these candidates, whoever's number one in the polls maybe, as the front runner. Well, when the media starts talking about someone as the front runner, that candidate starts getting noticed a lot more, and so may have an easier time raising money for the political campaign. And so that can have a huge effect. And, it kind of snowballs. Once they're seen as a front runner, then they'll pick up more support because people want to support a winner, and they'll donate money, and then that makes them more popular, and so then they get more money and more support, and that makes them more popular, and the cycle continues. And so the media can actually have a role in helping choose who gets the nomination to run for president sometimes in these other political races. Maybe that's healthy, maybe it's not, but it does happen sometimes. The media plays a big role in things like that. And in presidential elections, of course, going through the whole country, there's no way candidates can have a means of reaching all the voters except through mass media. And they'll do that a couple of different ways. They will buy campaign ads. They will pay money to show commercials on TV and ads on the radio and that kind of thing. But they will also get lots of free coverage on news programs because an election race is news. And if you're running for president, you're a newsmaker. And so people want to interview you, want to run stories about you and your ideas and things like that. And so they get a lot of free coverage as well. And that's how they get their message out to the people, is through the mass media. Candidates depend so much on the media that they will try to have policies that can be distilled into some kind of short slogan or soundbite that can fit easily into a TV commercial or a short news piece, because usually news stories don't last more than a couple of minutes. And so they will want to condense their ideas to where they're media friendly. And so they'll have some kind of catchy slogan or something like that. They can easily be spread through 30-second commercial or some short news story or something like that. So they kind of craft their message to where it's media friendly. And the impact of the media is to kind of shape the discourse of the campaign. And because advertising on TV is so important and very, very expensive, candidates have to spend a lot of their time raising millions of dollars. And that has changed how our politics works too. Because, they spend so much time raising money, they have to convince so many people to donate funds that takes up a lot of their time. And so that has made actually presidential election contests last a lot longer in a way, because people have to start raising money really early to build up a war chest, and so they can make it through an entire campaign paying for these expensive ads and things like that. So it's kind of dragged out how long the campaign season lasts, and you can kind of trace that back to the effect of the media on politics. It's they depend so much on it, they have to raise a ton of money in order to get their message out through the media. And so the media environment has really changed the way that races are run because of this. And so it just has had a profound effect on our politics. Also, candidates are very conscious of their image because of the heavy media coverage, and how they're going to look on TV and sound and all that really is very important to them. And so they'll spend a lot of time worrying about that. And sometimes this can make or break a campaign, how someone looks through this media coverage. For an example, back in the year 2000, Al Gore, the Vice President of the United States at the time, was running for president. And he kind of came off on television seeming aloof and robotic. You know, he kind of talked slowly in a monotone and hardly ever cracked a smile, and just kind of seemed detached from the whole process. And so much so that comedians started making fun of him, you know, like late night comedians and things like that. And it hurt his image a little bit. People don't want to vote for a stuffed suit, you know, or somebody who's so stiff and boring. And so it was a really, really close race, and doesn't get much closer. And maybe that cost him the election, how he was portrayed through the media. After the election was finally over, he kind of loosened up a little bit, seemed more friendly. But by then, you know, that was too late. People knew him as the image they'd seen in the media, and that may have affected their votes. You know, who knows if it was enough to cost him the election, but it might have been. And so how people are portrayed in the media, candidates and so forth, that can have a huge effect. And so they spend a lot of time worrying about the media coverage that they get, because if it's unfavorable, that could be be a huge detriment to their political campaign. Let's talk now about media regulation. Media in the United States, as we've talked about, is largely in private hands. The government pretty much keeps out of it, lets it operate as a free market, but there are some regulations that come into play. And that's especially true of the broadcast media. When by that we're talking about over-the-air TV that you can pick up with an antenna, not just cable or satellite, and also radio, which anyone that turns on a radio can hear it. And that's because there's only so many radio frequencies out there, and there's not enough frequencies to go around for everyone who wants to run a station. And so if you're dialing around on your FM radio, you'll know there's only so many slots there for a station to fit into. And the government has to divvy those up to people. And same with TV channels, broadcast TV channels. There's only so many of those, and they can't just give one to everyone who might want one. And so because of that, it's seen as using this broadcast frequency, which we all own as Americans. The whole country owns that broadcast spectrum. That if we're going to let you use that, that comes with some strings attached. That's not just a right, that's a privilege. And so if we're going to let you use that certain frequency, then we can kind of put some restrictions on you for that. In exchange for letting you broadcast, the government, for instance, requires stations to provide some public services. They will want you to do things like provide children's programming, for instance, or local news coverage. And so most stations want to do that stuff anyway because, they get people to watch it and get to sell ads and whatnot. But the government actually requires them to do that, and it can, because broadcasting over the air like that is a privilege. It's not a right. And so they can put some strings attached to that. They require some public service out of these different stations. The government's also able to control indecent language and things of that nature. If it's going out over the air, especially during the daytime hours when little Timmy hasn't gone to bed yet, we can control the naughty words that are on there, or the naked flesh that you might see, or whatever. We will make sure that, decent things are going on when kids might be tuning in and stuff. And there's a lot more control over the broadcast media than there would be even over cable channels or satellite or something like that. HBO can get away with all kinds of stuff that the broadcast media can. And that's why, because it's so accessible to everybody. And we want to protect the kiddos and stuff. And we can put these restrictions in place because it really is a privilege to be able to use this broadcast spectrum. And again, less restrictions on this kind of thing apply to cable TV. Kids are seen as less likely to turn on HBO in the first place. And also, there's basically an unlimited number of cable channels. We don't have the same issue with being only so many channels on the broadcast spectrum. On cable, there can be hundreds of channels. And so they don't have to serve the public good like broadcast channels do. There are just fewer restrictions and things. Regulations also keep too many media outlets from being owned by one company. For instance, if one corporation were to own, let's say, the only newspaper in town and all 3 TV stations and 4 radio stations, one person is controlling the flow of information. And we don't like that because that breaks down the marketplace of ideas. If one person is controlling too much of that flow through the marketplace, that hurts all of us because, if they don't want ideas to be heard, they can keep it off of their stations and out of their newspaper and whatever. And so that starts to break things down. And so we don't want one company or one person to have too much control over the marketplace. We want different players involved. We want, different people owning the different TV stations in town. And so the FCC can control that stuff and has rules on how many stations that one company or one individual can own because, again, we want different viewpoints. And if we have one person owning all of the stations and all the media outlets, then we're only getting one point of view instead of many points of view. Also, one restriction on the media is that they have to be careful about what they say about individual people. If you're a victim of false reporting, you can sue for what they call libel. If you have been kind of raked through the mud, by they report something that's false about you. Let's say that there's an individual who's running for office, and some newspaper claims he's had an affair, cheated on his wife or something, and it turns out to be wrong. Well, theoretically anyway, that person could sue the newspaper for a false report, and so that's kind of a control over the media as well. They can't just go report false things that paint other people in a bad light without the risk of lawsuits, and so that gives financial consequences that will the media will face if they are harming someone's reputation falsely. Also, there can be lawsuits for things like invasion of privacy. They are supposed to investigate things, but if they go too far in that, digging into someone's private life, they could have legal problems out of that. So there are some restrictions just based on our civil justice system. Censorship, as we've said, is very limited, but in some cases it does exist. And for an example, let's say the government, wants to stop a broadcast that would report on military movements. Where are our soldiers? Where are our ships? In a time of war. And if the story runs, that's going to tell the enemy, where to point their missiles because, it'll tell everyone where our soldiers are lined up. And we don't want that. And so in certain situations, very limited cases, the government might be able to censor some things. And so, again, very limited, but it can exist. Well, one rule that was designed to force broadcasters to serve the public good was something called the Fairness Doctrine. That was in place for decades before it was repealed by President Reagan in the 1980s. What the Fairness Doctrine was designed to do was make sure that broadcasters gave equal time to different political viewpoints. And so, for instance, if you had a radio station that let a Democrat get on the air and talk about Democratic policies for an hour, and a Republican listening to that could get mad about it. Because, well, they're talking to the Democrat, but they haven't had any Republicans talking about their views, and so that Republican could call the station and demand an hour of time to respond. Well, as a practical matter, this kept stations from allowing anyone to talk about their political opinions because they didn't want to get these phone calls, and have to give up valuable airtime to people with opposing points of view. And so that just meant that, basically a nobody off the street, maybe who wasn't much fun to listen to talk even, could demand equal time and force a station to put them on the air. And so pretty much what that did was just keep discussion of political opinions off the airwaves for many years. And you kind of understand the reason for the Fairness Doctrine a little bit, because if we only have, like 3 TV stations in, each city, or just a handful of radio stations, and that's the only media outlets, we want everyone to be able to get a balanced view and them to treat everybody fairly. They're being given the broadcast spectrum, through the public trust and all that. And so it's up, they have an ethical obligation basically to give everyone a balanced viewpoint of what's going on and further the marketplace of ideas. Well, that was sounded okay in theory. In practice, it meant that people were afraid to let anybody get on the air and talk about political ideas. And so certainly had some drawbacks, but as time changed, and so the need for the Fairness Doctrine ended up kind of disappearing. as the technology advanced, there was more and more ways for people to get information. And so in a way, the fairness doctrine just kind of outlived its usefulness. Because, cable stations came on the air, so we didn't just have, our 3 TV stations in every town. Now we had, hundreds of channels, different ways for ideas to get heard. Radio stations proliferated. There used to be just a couple of stations in every town. Now there's more and more of them. And now with the internet, of course, everyone who wants to can have a soapbox. And so the thought process that was behind the fairness doctrine kind of went out the window a little bit. And now the whole outlook has changed. Now we have entire channels dedicated to one political philosophy or another. For example, MSNBC markets itself as having more liberal points of view. They are a news channel, but also a lot of their airtime is devoted to commentary on the news. And those commentators often have a liberal viewpoint, and they kind of market themselves that way. If you're a leftist, turn into MSNBC. On the other hand, Fox News has more conservative commentators. And so if you're a right-wing person, go watch Fox News, and you'll hear viewpoints that you like. And so basically, we're kind of going back to the party press in a way. Everyone has a TV channel to kind of support their point of view. And so since there are so many channels, we can kind of get away with that now because there are so many different outlets. And that doesn't really hurt anyone now, to have only one viewpoint represented, because if you don't like it, you can change the channel and hear a different viewpoint on another channel. And so we don't have to force one channel to offer every point of view, because there's all these other points of view and being offered on other channels too. So in a world with 500 satellite TV channels, something like that, some of these regulations just don't make a lot of sense anymore, because they were designed for a world where there was only 3 networks, no cable, no internet. And so the whole rationale for the fairness doctrine kind of went out the window. And so the trend has been toward letting people say whatever they want to pretty much on the media, so long as it's not indecent or obscene or whatever. However, fairly recently, there was some talk among Democrats about bringing back the fairness doctrine to broadcast radio, and that probably had a lot to do with the success of conservative commentators, such as Rush Limbaugh. And these commentators have shows on AM talk radio a lot of the times, and for whatever reason, it seems like conservatives have had more success in that medium than liberal commentators. And so the Democrats, some of them anyway, fairly recently, kind of got their ire up about that and said, well, we ought to bring this back. That'll shut up these people that are saying things we don't like, basically. And so there has been a debate about that. But really, the increased number of outlets today that we have probably make controls like this on content unconstitutional. Because, the default rule is we want freedom of speech. We want people to be able to say what they want to say when they want to say it. We have freedom of the press. And so the rationale for these restrictions was really based on the small number of frequencies available for broadcast. Now we have almost unlimited choices for getting our information. And so really the whole rationale has gone away. If someone tried to bring it back, there would probably be constitutional challenges that might very well be successful. So, well, there you go. You didn't sign up for a course in mass communications maybe this semester, but you got a week on it anyway. And I hope you can see now how critically important the media's role is in our government and our politics. And so the two things really do go hand in hand. So with that, I will sign off for now and see you next week.